Welcome to the Orca. Well, after years of work, close calls, and negotiations with no fewer than two provincial governments, all indications are that Royal Dutch Shell will announce this week that it plans to go ahead with a $40 billion LNG Canada project. So how do you put that into economic benefits? How do you draw the lines between what could happen and what will happen? Stewart Muir of Resource Works joins us now to help us work out that problem. Stewart, hello.
Hi, Rick.
We expect to hear later this week that Royal Dutch Shell and its partners are prepared to make a $40 billion investment in Canada and BC's LNG industry. Now, you've been on this file for a long time. How big a deal is this?
Well, there's never been a project of this scale that's private sector in BC. It will stretch from one side of the province to the other in terms of the economic activity that's created, and we'll see it in the upstream part of BC as well as the coast and in between through the new pipeline that will be needed for this.
But when you have a $40 billion injection over time into the BC economy, what does that mean?
Well, what we found in some of our studies is that the benefits of this rural activity and natural resources actually has a very high impact in Metro Vancouver. It shows up in finance, in leasing, in insurance, in all kinds of transportation. You think of the thousands of workers who will be in camps building those things. Well, they have to eat 3 meals a day, and the food for that has to come from somewhere. That's Metro Vancouver, a lot of it. And untold other components of it, as well as all the services needed. It affects the whole country as well. You know, the people in Toronto who don't think of this stuff very often, it really does have an impact on what they do on Bay Street in the financial world and raising the money. All the companies that are drilling in Northeast BC, for example, require a lot of capital and a lot of technology expertise, much of which comes from Alberta and east across Canada.
There are still some political hurdles to be dealt with. Do you see any problems?
Well, I think the big one is around climate, because we're going to see if what the BC Greens leader, Andrew Weaver, comes about, as he says it will, a resistance to the concept that offering the world a cleaner form of fuel, which is natural gas as LNG, is good for the climate. What we're going to see is some people who are doctrinaire about where the borders lie in climate protection to say, no, it's not about saving the planet. It's about some numbers that have been devised for BC alone. And if we break those targets, then we can't possibly help anyone else. Now, you could probably tell in my description of that where I stand on it. I really do think that if we continue to have these artificial borders around emissions, it's not going to allow the world to progress at all.
Mr. Weaver has pretty much said that he's not in favor of any LNG or resource development. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think that will be a political matter for the legislature. We're going to see where the Liberals land on this. I would think they would want, after so many years of supporting it, from really in 2011 being the genesis of the current LNG opportunity, they'll want to see it come to fruition, because LNG Canada is not the only one in play. There's one or two others, and beyond that, there may be even more. But for now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Getting this first one in is in everyone's interest. It's also in the interest of the BC Greens, because it does support a broad, long-term move towards a lower carbon economy. That much is pure and simple. It's in the numbers.
Stewart, environmentalists, conservationists will still point the finger at fracking as well and extracting the gas. How do you deal with that?
Well, I've been observing the general work being done in groups like Geoscience BC, for example, which is a science-based organization that is committed to developing information about issues like that. Water storage from fracking is one of them. Methane escape, which can occur at the fracking site or the wellhead where the gas is collected. So if you don't have modern equipment and practices to do that, yes, you can have big problems from methane. I think the general story now, though, is that it's an older generation of equipment that could be the problem, whereas the newer stuff and the newer practices are so much better these days in being able to stop leakages from happening. And don't forget, when they lose natural gas from the collection system, they're losing money. So there's a strong economic incentive, not just a climate incentive, to do something about that.
If this project goes ahead, What will this mean for future resource development in BC?
Well, I think it does send a signal at a time when maybe there's been a little bit of wavering, a little bit of erosion of confidence in the investing world that BC is a place to do business. Whether that's right or wrong, that this impression has come about, is one that could be debated. But I think that it's going to send a signal that we can get things done. And after the disappointments we've had with the oil pipelines, not just in BC, but also Energy East, that's not just a BC thing. It's important for Canada to be able to show the world that we can deliver on major projects that are complicated and take people getting together to solve problems collaboratively and get over their differences, if those are political or what have you. And so I think it's going to be a good signal in that regard too.
Stewart, as I mentioned, you've been on this file for many years. What does this mean for you now and all the hard work that's been put in leading up to this moment?
Well, I do feel that when you think back to the early days in this, I started following in 2011 when it started to become a provincial priority. But you know what? I also, back in my years as a business editor at the Vancouver Sun, we followed what was happening in the Northeast. And one group that didn't get a lot of credit is the NDP, actually, in the 1990s. One of the advisors of Resource Works is Dan Miller, a former premier. He was one of those who, in those days, was part of bringing about regulations that were needed to develop this in the first place. So credit where it's due. It was the early 2000s when natural gas in BC really came into its own. That was under Premier Campbell. We saw some bonanza years when the billions of dollars from natural gas royalties paid for a lot of things that we might take for granted today. Now, there's been a lot of changes over the years, and I think this one, over the last few years, we would hear, oh, LNG, it's a pipe dream, it's a political vanity, it's just sloganeering. Well, here we are with the proof. All that work was worth doing, and many, many hands. You know, I think Vaughn Palmer tweeted this morning that it's First Nations, it's federal government, it's Christy Clark, it's John Horgan, it's environmentalists who've come to the table to do business. It's above all, I think it's the workers who are out there in the field who are making it happen. They've been out there doing the unglamorous work to lay down the basis for this to happen. It's pretty thankless stuff. The paychecks are good, but the weather's cold and the work is hard. So, you know, I think this is a day for all of those people to celebrate.
You mentioned First Nations, and I want to close on this. They say this is a generational project. The royalties from this project will pay them benefits and their young people for years to come. How do you feel about that?
Well, this is what I hear from so many First Nations. I spent part of this summer traveling out to First Nations who I don't normally see unless it's in Vancouver or Victoria or places. I wanted to go out and hear directly from chiefs in their own territories for a documentary we were making that's coming out soon called Homeland Journey. You know, what does it mean to you? And what I heard consistently was these chiefs are worried about culture and language and keeping young people or providing an incentive for young people to come back to the territories, which are mostly rural. And there often isn't a big economy to come home to. So, you know, why would you leave a job in the city? You know, I talked to one chief. His daughter was a headmaster or headmistress of a private school in Bristol, England, who thought that maybe this would be the trigger that would let her come home someday, that there would be an agreement with the pipeline that would maybe create enough economic activity. The skills needed to do those jobs, which are very good jobs, are ones that often are lacking in First Nations communities. So what I've seen across the north from the west to the east is a lot of training programs where First Nations are pursuing the skills they need to do this. And I think that is part of building capacity in order to have the language programs that people want and have the cultural renaissance that is, I think, at the heart of reconciliation. So this is not just an industrial project to help out some shareholders or help workers who've got a job. It really is seen by First Nations as having that potential for them.
The largest single private investment in this country's history, and we've got our fingers crossed we'll hear it confirmed later this week.
Yes, we do.
Thank you, Stewart.
Thanks, Rick.